FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. It's November 15th, 2017. Are you fed up? Well, you should be fed up. And if you're not, after you hear the next guest, I guarantee you will be fed up. And that's because her book is Fed Up, An Insider's Take Why the Federal Reserve is Bad for America. I'm talking about Danielle D'Martino Booth. And before we get started, be part of the show, participate, send us an email, kl@kerrylutz.com, or use the Twitter feed @KerryLutz. So the Federal Reserve, it's been written about by countless commentators, authors, etc. Some accuse it of being an inherently evil institution. Others see it more as a necessary safety valve or insurance institution to keep the American financial system solvent. Danielle, the question is, what do you see it as? Having been in the belly of the beast, and I use that totally in figurative terms, no judgment imparted, where do you come down on this? And by the way, welcome to the show and thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me today. I do believe, unlike the Ron Paul acolytes out there, that we cannot end the Fed. So I would side kind of with the second characterization that you noted, that it is something that we do have to have a lender of last resort. I look at it as a national security issue. I would hate to see what the Chinese would do if our banking system was completely unprotected. That being said, I think that about 90% of the institution needs to be rebuilt. Rather than end the Fed, I like to say that we need to upend the Fed.
Yeah. And look, if you're not aware of why the Fed was started, there was a panic. Well, there was a panic in 1893, and that was really bloody. It led to years of deflation. Then we had the panic of 1907, which led to the bailout of the country, basically, or the banking system by private banking interests, J.P. Morgan, and that whole cabal. And then they said, we don't want to be in the position because next time when it hits the fan, it could be so bad that we won't even be able to bail it out. So they concoct this Federal Reserve, and things have never been the same since. Coincidentally, at the time, Danielle, as you're more than well aware of, they come up with the income tax. And so we fast forward to the Great Depression, and they basically sit on the sidelines, the Federal Reserve, for the most part, and watch the American banking system implode. So credibility-wise, how can an institution that oversaw the implosion of the U.S. banking system during the Great Depression, how can they come back and save it in the early 2000s and still have credibility?
Well, it's interesting. I was at a conference recently sitting by a gentleman who said that Ben Bernanke was a great patriot for everything he had done for the country. Now, look, I think Dr. Bernanke is a brilliant individual. Some of the work that he's done on the Great Depression has been fantastic, but I don't side with the people who thought that the Fed saved the world in 2009 and 2008 because they created the situation to begin with. And I'll cite, I don't know if you've been following some of Ray Dalio's comments lately, sure. The guy who runs Bridgewater, $160 billion, but he's concerned right now that the Federal Reserve is about to repeat the policy error of 1937 by overhiking the economy into recession when it's still in a fairly vulnerable position. And it's also, what put, as you said, the Great Depression.
Hey, and so we go back to 08, 09. Now, look, I don't consider myself in any of these Fed officials' intellectual realm. I don't have 8 PhDs, et cetera. But I walked out of a hotel in Las Vegas in 2006, and every single taxi cab had a sign mounted on top. No interest loan, brand new, 3-bedroom, 2-bath townhouse, $693 per month. And, basically no money down. And I looked to my partners, one on either side, and I said, the real estate boom is over. When they have to give this stuff away for nothing, with no skin in the game, this is going to end badly. So Danielle, if I can see this, a lowly commercial litigation attorney, corporate attorney, why couldn't these guys see it? The most brilliant people and the finest economists out there. I mean, the system had to collapse because there was the incentives for bad behavior, for irresponsible behavior became overwhelming.
You know, you're exactly right. I started at the Fed in 2006, and I had for years before then been predicting the housing crisis because I was speaking to traders on desks who would joke like a bunch of jocks in a locker room about 125% loan to value loans and liar loans and ninjas. This was not a kept secret of any kind. These were known knowns on the street. And I was astonished when I landed at the Fed in 2006. You know, my hair's practically on fire. And nobody, very few people, I should say, on the inside were aware of the magnitude of the storm that was about to hit the economy. And they continued to revert back to what Bernanke said, which is we haven't seen nationwide house prices decline since the Great Depression. It's not going to happen. And I'm like, people, the banking system is national. Countrywide is national. Subprime mortgages are viral. This is going to happen.
Yeah. And yet it's so much easier to be reactive than proactive. Hey, it'll probably never happen. Why worry about it? Housing prices always go up. They bought into the same hype that the poor, unsophisticated home buyers in places like Florida, Nevada, and all over the country, Arizona, California, sure. They all bought into it. And yet... And
care of Chair Greenspan, investors bought into pro forma accounting during the dot-com boom. But again, I'll go back to your taxi. Whenever it's a situation of the taxi driver talking to you, which in 1999 they were, giving you stock tips or asking for stock tips, you can figure out a lot about the economy in a taxi.
Yeah, well, the legendary investor, father of security analysis, Benjamin Graham, once said, if the boot black is giving you stock tips, that was his term for a shoeshine person. Have to be politically correct. I haven't really met many females shining shoes, so I'll say shoe shine boy. Or the elevator operator, which we don't really have anymore except in very exclusive buildings in Manhattan. If they're giving you stock tips, then you better get the heck out of the market because it's time. And when they start giving you real estate tips, like, hey, I bought this money for no money down. I flipped it 6 months later. I made $50,000, $100,000, rinse, repeat. And yet the Fed is supposed to be a couple steps back, objective, right, taking in these signs and formulating policy to avoid these very outcomes. And, you mentioned in your book, the Fed could have stopped this. They could have pulled away the punch bowl way before it ever became a factor. And, we wouldn't be having this conversation now of the great housing collapse of 2000. Well, it really started in 2007, but we wouldn't be having this conversation because it would have never occurred. And yet they basically just created their own reality.
They did. And, you just quoted William McChesney Martin, who is the longest, was the longest serving Fed chairman in its 104-year history. And, he managed through various administrations to remain apolitical. He stood above the fray. He was never mentally malleable like Greenspan was, and he knew he wasn't running the Fed to win any popularity contests, and that it truly was the Fed's job to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. But Greenspan, in my view at least, things changed over the past 3 decades with the advent of Greenspan, because, by the way, Paul Volcker was no friend of the markets. He could care less. He was our last objective head of the Fed. But Greenspan's philosophy that you could only clean up the damage after a bubble bursts is the underlying fallacy that got us into the stock market crash of 2000 and the housing industry, and fast forwards us to today in the precarious position we find ourselves in now.
All right. Got a question for you. So sure. The Federal Reserve is neither federal nor a reserve, obviously. It's a private entity shares owned by the big banks. And
I'm going to have to stop you and correct you. If you work at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., your email address ends with .gov. And every dime that comes into the Federal Reserve Board after it covers expenses is remitted to the Treasury.
True.
Now, the district banks, my email address when I was at the Dallas Fed used to end with .org. And we are the same as the Federal Reserve Board. After the expenses to cover the operating costs of the district are covered, each district is federally mandated to remit any and all profits over to the board, which in turn remits them to the Treasury. So it is a quasi-public private institution.
Correct. So, but the entities that own the stock in the Federal Reserve are J.P. Morgan Chase, go down the list, Citibank, all the Goldman Sachs, I guess, owns shares now. How much influence do they really exert on the operations, or at least the policy that is being promulgated, formulated in D.C., and presumably to a lesser degree in the regional feds?
Well, what you're pointing to, I think, is a lot of the damage that emanated from there being too cozy a relationship between the New York Fed and the banks that it is supposed to be regulating. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, in fact, some of the powers of the New York Fed were stripped from it in order to prevent this going forward. That being said, I think that the big banks do continue to have undue influence over Fed policy, but a lot of it comes through political avenues and the lobbying efforts that take place in Washington, D.C., and the influence that exerts.
Okay. So there's an open line of communications. There has to be, because in order for the Fed to monitor its policy, it's got to be connected to these large banks. And There's definitely potential for problems there. So let's go back to the financial crisis. Granted, the Fed's policies certainly fueled the fire, like pouring gasoline on an open fire. But the actors, the heads of the large banks, never were called to account. I'm not saying they should have been put in jail. I mean, I think that's extreme. The government's encouraging.
But there were certain individuals in whose institutions outright fraud was raft, and they did not actually. They were not prosecuted. Gillian Tett, who's an editor at the Financial Times, wrote a wonderful column in the midst of the heat of the darkest moments of the financial crisis. And she wrote way back then that if there were no perp walks associated with the financial crisis, that our American society would pay the price in one form one day. And look at the extreme rise of anger and populism that we've seen as a result of no single banker, like the Keating Five, making that perp walk.
Yeah, the only guy they got was some guy from England who was fixing LIBOR, and they put him away for 10 years, and he was just, I don't want to call him a sociopath. He was probably mildly autistic and didn't really understand totally what he was doing. And the guy who supposedly stole Goldman Sachs's code, which he didn't, the Russian programmer. Those are the only two people that are called to account.
And they're kind of ancillary players when you consider what I mentioned before, outright mortgage fraud.
Yeah. Oh, it was, I know people who were in the business, and I used to think Wall Street was these brilliant financial alchemists that could just create value. And then when I found out that mortgage-backed securities was pretty much their mainstay, they weren't making any money except there. And I said, anybody could do that. It's just debt. You're not producing anything other than debt. So question is, what should have been done to these too big to fail banks back in the crash? Should they have been put into conservatorship, broken up? Are they really, now they've gotten so much larger than they were even before the crash. So,
look, I think that there were certainly candidates to have been broken up in the aftermath of the financial crisis, without a doubt, especially the ones that were completely outright insolvent. And then to what you've just alluded to, Dodd-Frank adds fuel to the fire, and we institutionalize too big to fail in our legal code. I mean, these are just, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah,
and today we have a situation wherein we would have to go back into rescue mode, and that really again, I think that there would be, I think if the average working man and woman on the street were able to connect the dots, there would be pitchforks at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington.
Oh yeah, and the very nature, the notion of Dodd-Frank, they were major participants and accelerants in the crisis. I mean, every time there was a motion brought on or a law proposed to increase down payments, to increase equity requirements, Barney Frank was there, screaming racism and, you're hurting the poor and everything else. And same with Chris Dodd. He was his senatorial counterpart doing exactly the same thing and getting paid off by Countrywide. And I think Chris Dodd is now head of the Motion Picture Association of America, if I remember correctly. I mean, why wasn't this guy tarred and feathered? Our leaders, our government officials were just as responsible or more so than the financial actors in bringing this whole thing about.
Oh, absolutely they were. And it was a matter of public record that these were, as you just said, the literally top 1, 2, 3 people in terms of monies paid to them by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The third one on the list, by the way, was a young senator by the name of Barack Obama. So it's fascinating to me that the corruption was as public and vetted as it was, and still nothing happened.
Yeah, I mean, John McCain, I don't have much respect for him, but he did propose a bill to rein in and up down payment requirements. And he said that Fannie and Freddie are going to become problems. Oh, no, Fannie and Freddie, they're so solvent. You could bet your kid's future on them. They're so solvent. And now, aren't we back in the same position with Fannie and Freddie that we were before, except they're not making liar loans. They're not making, greater loan to value, 125% loans and, things like that. But it's still, they've encouraged over leveraging in the real estate sector.
They have, and it's even more interesting because if you look at 2009 and 2010 vintages of FEMA loans, that was where all the risk piled in after the crisis, because it was the only place where you could have a 3% down payment.
Right.
And I mean, we should have listened to John McCain way back then because he happened to have a front row seat in a sand state. You were in Las Vegas. Well, something tells me he could take a drive around Phoenix in a taxi cab and see the same exact phenomenon, because Phoenix was also one of these ground zero type municipalities that was really shellacked after the crisis.
So here's a question for you. The guys in The Big Short who really exploited the whole situation, Are they heroes or are they villains?
Well, look, if you consider the fact that the Federal Reserve didn't lose a penny on the firms that it bailed out, as toxic as those loans were, they did come back in value. My view of the guys in The Big Short is short selling is what keeps markets honest. And today there's not even an ability to be honest because we have the dishonesty of passive investing in the markets. So there is no such thing as stock selection or trying to identify a weak link in the system and short it. That's the way that creative destruction works.
Yeah.
I'm a big advocate of short sellers.
Absolutely. Hey, I got a technical question that you're probably one of the few people who may know the answer to it and will actually tell the truth. So we had all of these mortgage-backed securities, and they took tranches, they sliced and diced everything. So you couldn't determine home ownership because the mortgages were, well, I'm getting the interest for the next 20 years. You got the principal at a discount. Who owns the mortgage? So now we had a situation where the Fed basically, correct me if I'm wrong, bought up all of these securities. Are they in the position now, or have they been effectively reassembling, reconfiguring, and making these mortgages whole in these securities that they purchased? Was that one of their purposes in doing it?
Oh, I think you're giving a little bit too much credit to the markets desk in New York. You're talking about, there have been hundreds of, there have been upwards of billions of dollars made for the people who had to finally, over a 10-year period, put Humpty Dumpty back together that was called Lehman Brothers. I'm afraid the Fed does not pay a high enough salary to have accomplished what you just described.
Okay, well, hey.
And that's actually one of the main tenets of the book, is that we've got 800 PhDs working at the Fed. I'm sorry, but you don't need 800 PhDs to monitor the economy. There's a ton of overlap. And, my vote would be to, diminish their ranks by at least 50% and take all the money that you've saved and then go out to MIT and Harvard and hire people who can do what you just described, who can read the most convoluted bank balance sheet imaginable and understand exactly what a shadow banking system is and what a tranche is. So, but the Fed is sorely lacking in terms of brain power and the ability to regulate the banks that it's supposed to regulate. And I don't say this in a derogatory way. My former analyst is now part of the New York markets desk, and he's one of the smartest kids I've ever known. But he's what I would consider to be the exception.
Anomaly.
And these were the determinations found by outside objective people in the aftermath of the crisis. It's that the Fed was outgunned.
Yeah, and well, look, even the management of JP Morgan Chase, they didn't know the risk that they had. And there's a lot of exotic instruments. They still don't really grasp the risk until it's too late. And you have like the London whale just blowing the markets to bits.
Well, right. That's hence the term, hence the sister term to too big to fail, too complex to regulate.
Yeah. And that's derivatives and all that.
That's a problem.
There's very few people that really understand the derivatives markets, and then they change. So you might have understood them 10 years ago, but now they've evolved. You probably don't understand them now unless you've really been in it.
We got to a DEFCON 1 state just last year with Deutsche Bank because of derivatives. I mean, this is a real-time situation, and somebody whispered in Angela Merkel's ear, we're going to have a problem if we play tough with Deutsche Bank, and she said, I'll reach for Germany's checkbook on second thought.
Yeah, well, I said then, I'm glad you brought that up. I said then, and I say it now, no politician wants to be known as the person that brought down the global financial system. So when it comes to the taxpayer's checkbook, as opposed to their own legacy and their standing in the world, they're going to write the check every single time, whether it's U.S., Germany, France, Italy, Spain. Pick a country that's had a banking crisis in the past 10 years. They're all going to bail out. So gold and cryptocurrencies. Does gold have any role in the international monetary system now, Danielle, either actual or de facto?
I think that right now gold is playing the role of the best offense is a good defense. If you look at what China's trying to accomplish, they're trying to increase trading in their currency, and their eye on the prize. Their ultimate goal is to have the yuan unseat the dollar and attain reserve currency status. Well, they have seen the way to do this. A first step has been the acquisition of a ton of gold. And if you will agree to transact in petro yuan as opposed to petro dollars, they will back these with gold. So it's not, do I think that we could ever go back on a gold standard? I don't think that's practical, but I view gold, A, as a political instrument in the middle of a very quiet currency war that is ongoing, and B, as your ultimate safe haven asset play as an investor, because what we do know about markets is when markets correct, they correct together. Correlations line up. You lose your sorry, I was going to use a bad word there. You lose your investment, regardless of what asset you are in. Emphasize the ass and the et. And gold is the only place that truly trades outside of that. Cryptocurrency, I don't understand it. I think it's magnificent in terms of the size of bubble that it is, but it is definitely a reflection of people's anxiety with fiat currencies.
Great point. So, in your opinion, do central banks care about the price of gold? Do they actively intervene in the gold markets directly or indirectly to try to keep it at a certain level? What is their relationship to the yellow metal?
Yeah, I don't think that I'm not going to feed the conspiracy theories on central banks and gold. I'm going to talk out of the other side of my mouth, though, and say that, in the wildest dreams of the most interventionist central bankers out there, the ones who think that cash needs to be abolished and that the future central banks of the world should be able to truly control our spending down to the last penny, they are definitely studying very closely blockchain. It's not so much that they believe in Bitcoin per se, but they will let the world and the technology completely be maximized and made efficient so that one day they can have their dream come true and come in as big brother and completely control all of our transactions. That's the part that scares me.
Hey, it's an interesting point you raised, and I wrote an article about this 3-4 years ago called Operation Dirty Money. So we all know that one of the Fed's main responsibilities is to distribute currency. It gets printed up by the Treasury, all in accord with that weird relationship between the government and the Fed. But they're Federal Reserve notes, not bills, but notes. That means evidence of indebtedness. And they're distributed by the regional Fed banks, Federal Reserve banks, which there's 11 of them, if memory serves me correct, right? Do I have that?
There's 12. Including New York.
Yeah,
New York is the permanent vote.
Yeah. So what I noticed a number of years ago is that you don't get clean bills anymore. You don't get shiny, brand new notes. They're all like, you go to the ATM. When you'd go to the ATM years ago, they would all be perfect, brand new, pristine bills, notes. Now they're garbage. I mean, it looks like currency could be thrown out. If you had a piece of paper on your desk that was as dirty and dog-eared and ragged as your average 20, you'd throw it in the garbage. This isn't by accident, is it?
Well, I mean, I will say that the first stop in the tour of the Fed with human resources is past the shredding machines, and they do make you want to cry because you're watching these bills that have been taken out of circulation get shredded to kingdom come. But as far as what the mint in Fort Worth is churning right now in terms of crisp bills, I can't really speak too much to that, but I can tell you that recently I was at the bank and they gave me a stack of bills that were so crispy and new that I could barely separate them. So there's still some printing going on.
Yeah, I know. And in Vegas, you're not going to get rid of cash. I mean, cash is king there. People are not going to trade in cash for Venmo or PayPal to get tipped in PayPal. It ain't happening. So I think this is an upward battle that they're eventually going to lose. Hey, one final question. So you leave the private sector, you go to the quasi-public sector, and it felt like
a big bureaucracy, let me tell you.
What was the most surprising thing when you walked in the door there and you're really in the belly of the beast and you're really seeing the way things work, not the way you've been led to believe they're working?
So when you start out on Wall Street, it's all about what you produce. And it's all about what you're producing tomorrow. That's about what your shelf life is. What have you done for me during this trading day? You never, ever, ever leave your desk during the trading day. And that was kind of ingrained in my mind. I provide this anecdote just to illustrate a point. I would always be horrified to see the PhDs convene in the foyer at the elevator around 11 o'clock, go down to the executive dining room, have a nice cushy 2-hour lunch, discuss what their latest paper is going to be, and roll back upstairs around 1 o'clock. And I thought to myself, are these people on the clock? But it was, it's just an anecdote, but it is not the most productive institution in the country. In fact, I was fairly horrified at how little was accomplished in terms of helping the people on the Federal Open Market Committee make better monetary policy. My mentor at the Fed, who was a 40-year veteran, Harvey Rosenblum, said, looking back at his career, he said the gravest sin of these PhDs is that they enter the Fed and for the rest of their careers continue defending their dissertations, as opposed to really looking out and exploring ways to make better monetary policy. Now, I don't want to paint with a broad brush and say that there aren't brilliant, good, practical economists inside the Fed. There certainly are. But my point is we could get rid of a whole bunch of them and the productivity of the institution might even improve.
And they're not even a governmental institution, quasi-governmental. You start getting into all these different divisions, departments, or as I like to say, the Department of Redundancy Department. And, there is so much lost productivity or non-existent productivity. What was your incentive?
Each individual district that is run in an inefficient manner does take money out of taxpayers' wallets, period. The more efficiently they're run, the more money is remitted back to the Treasury, i.e. the taxpayer. So it really gets under my skin to see how inefficient and unproductive these institutions are, because it does take money out of my wallet.
Well, it's a study in Freakonomics. It's all about incentives. They have no incentives, zero incentives to be productive and to get better at their jobs. Where's the incentives? That's the whole problem with the public sector, and that's why the public sector is always going to be a parasitic growth on the economy and really speaks volumes for limited government. But we'll leave that for another day, Danielle. Just tell us your book. I'm sure it's selling really well. I've been reading it. When I'm finished, I'm going to have you back on. Again, the book is Fed Up, an Insider's Take on Why the Federal Reserve is Bad for America. I assume the book's been selling pretty well, hasn't it?
It has. It went all the way up to 22 on Amazon. I was absolutely delighted. The Audible version's been great. I recorded it myself.
Oh, good for you.
And I write a weekly newsletter as well. So hop on my website. It's DIMARTINOBOOTH, DMartinoBooth.com. And if you want the spiciest, most entertaining Twitter feed in the country, that's my Twitter handle as well, at D'Martino Booth.
All right. We're going to hook up with both of them. I encourage everyone out there to buy this book. I mean, you would think it's a financial book and it's kind of technical and it's going to be, a little on the, shall we say, dull side. It couldn't be further from the truth. When there's a chapter that starts with Luddite, then you had me right there. And things like group stink and who would buy that crap, St. Greenspan. I mean, these are gems here. I mean, you have a knack for coming up with these chapter headings, and want to thank you for the book, Danielle. Thanks for coming on the show. Hey, go over to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. In the show notes, you will find a link directly to Danielle's site. Sign up for her newsletter, sign up for ours, and the Twitter feed's at Kerry Lutz. The Facebook page is Financial Survival Network. Danielle, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure and very informative as well. We'll talk to you again real soon.
Thanks. Look forward to it.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.